So this is about Black history, American history. Okay, so let's just kick it off right here. The thing that bothers me the most about progressive people and non-progressive people alike is when folks nowadays always ask, why do you have to make it about race? And that question bothers me because it lets me know that folks really don't understand that at the root of all of this, it all really is actually about race. But we don't understand because we have not had, in my opinion, a very frank conversation about the history of our country. And I'll never forget when Charlottesville happened. And to be frank, Charlottesville was something that had been brewing for about a year. And the root of Charlottesville was that the then vice mayor of Charlottesville, who was a young African-American man, his name is Dr. Wes Bellamy, who's a good friend of mine. Wes introduced a resolution at the city council to remove the Robert E. Lee statue from a place called Emancipation Park. He just wanted to remove it somewhere else. He said we could just take it down altogether, or the statue could be relocated, but his view was that the statue should not be in a park. Upon the introduction of that resolution, neo-Nazis, folks that identify as defenders of the Confederacy, there's like a group in Charlottesville that's called that. All these folks came out and they attacked him. There were protests about the taking down of the statue. There were folks that, on the side of that, this is revisionist history, so on and so forth. And the radical right started to organize. And folks that identify as neo-Nazis, white supremacists, defenders of the Confederacy, so on and so forth, they started to organize. And so what we saw in Charlottesville some months ago was a culmination of something that had been brewing for about a year. Like, folks in the community of Charlottesville that were on the side of the issue of taking down the statue were terrorized. There were so many people who lived in Charlottesville that could not sleep in their homes at night, because folks were throwing things through their windows, folks had thrown, the then vice mayor of Charlottesville hadn't even been sleeping in Charlottesville for the last 6 months when Charlottesville happened, because it was too dangerous for him to be in Charlottesville. So when people talk about that we live in this post-racial America sometimes, or that, Symone, when I see you, I just don't see color. I just see you as a person. It lets me know that we don't really understand our history. And so I want to talk about what, in my view, I want to give you the for the culture version of American history. And then we can have a discussion about it. So the for the culture version of American history is that, Black people, a lot of people of color, Black people particularly, they fought on the side of the British in the Revolutionary War. Because through the British, they knew that they would actually be free. When the founding fathers founded this country, it was absolutely founded on a system of white supremacy. A system of white supremacy, and a system that was absolutely economically driven. And so the system of slavery was all about economics in America. So when people ask what was the Civil War fought over, well, it wasn't fought over slavery, it was fought over economics. Slavery was about economics. So by the time we fast forward the founding of this country, so by the time the Civil War happens, the Civil War only really happens, folks seceded from the Union because the seat of power, Washington, D.C., had figured out that there were better ways to make money, to be economically successful, than the system of slavery. That there were ways that rich Northerners could participate in the economic abundance in the vehicle and the engine that is the United States of America without going through the institution of slavery. And so it wasn't that folks thought slavery was just so bad. There were some people that believed that. But for the most part, it was folks that realized that there were other ways that we can make money. And we do not have to kowtow to the Southerners, i.e. the slave owners anymore, because we can now be profitable in other ways. The slaveholding states didn't like that. So they seceded from the Union. And in the Articles of Secession, they cited animosity of the non-slave holding states towards them as a reason for their secession. So again, when people say that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, literally in the Articles of Secession, they told you that it was. So So they secede from the Union. I would like to say that America made a decision about who they wanted to be during the time of the Civil War, and they didn't want to be a slave-holding state anymore, again, for reasons that they found ways to benefit themselves economically other ways. But if you think about it, the generals of the Confederacy were fighting to preserve the system that the founding fathers established. America just changed the game and said, okay, well, we don't want to, that's not necessarily the system we want anymore. So you can understand why there's some people in this country that do not view folks that fought on the side of the Confederacy as treasonous terrorists that took up arms against the United States government. Because they were literally, if you think about it, were merely fighting to preserve a system that the founding fathers established. The founding fathers said, this is what it is. And then all of a sudden, they changed the game. And the generals of Confederate, and the folks that seceded from the Union that became what we know now and refer to as the Confederacy were like, well, hold up. I thought this is how we did things. And the Union was like, nah, not anymore. Again, this is the for the culture version of, what happened. So the Civil War is fought. For people that say, oh, the Civil War could have been reached by a compromise. There were many compromises. The Missouri Compromise was one of them. Like, there were literally multiple compromises. So the Civil War is fought. The Union wins. And the treasonous terrorists that took up arms against the United States government because they wanted to fight for what they thought was their right to own people that looked like me were not punished. They were literally rewarded with electoral college seats, with political positions, with sometimes additional land and business stuff. They were not punished. In Germany, Nazi generals were put on trial. People are still being put on trial today. And so one could argue we have so many issues in our system. We talk about this system of white supremacy. We have so many issues in our current society because we never really reckoned with what happened. We did not have an intentional conversation about it. Nobody, quote unquote, got in trouble. Folks just shook hands and was like, okay. The North and the South came back together, and the North was like, can y'all just not ever do that again? Basically, and the South was like, okay, well, you know what? We'll try. But y'all got to give us some stuff. And the North is like, look, we just don't want to ever have to go through this again. But no one was held accountable. No one was held accountable. So then you have this period of Reconstruction where, and I encourage folks to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, his most recent book, We Were 8 Years in Power. That, yes, talks about, life and times during the Obama administration, but it specifically talks about this time of Reconstruction, where there were burgeoning black businesses and there were blacks that were in power in places throughout the United States, but also the South. And it was during the time of Reconstruction, actually, that these Confederate monuments were erected by a group called, I remember, Daughters of the Confederacy. And they literally went around paying money to erect these statues of Confederate generals to literally remind black people of who they used to be, of what happened. But again, when you don't know history, you have people that think these statues of the Confederacy were things that were erected by the United States government, and that these are pertinent parts of our real history, when these statues were erected during the time of Reconstruction. So these statues are erected, all of these policies are then put in place to curb the ambitions and success of black people in this country, from politics all the way down to business. Then it's followed by Jim Crow and all this other stuff that we all know about today. So I like to talk about that and start there because no one was really ever held accountable for the atrocities of our American history. And because nobody was really held accountable, and because we don't have intentional conversations about the lack of accountability, that is where some of our real issues stem from. Because race is still a very uncomfortable conversation to discuss in America, and we ain't even being taught, the kids aren't even being taught real history in school. You talk about Black history. February is Black History Month, and I was at where was I? I was at the University of Texas A&M Corpus Christi a couple days ago, and the student reporter asked me if I thought Black History Month was still needed. And I was like, well, that's an interesting premise to your question. Do you think that Black History Month is still needed? I just want to figure out where the question comes from. And they said that there are many people that think that we don't need a Black History Month anymore. And I was like, well, unfortunately, for what so many people think and know about Black history in this country, one, starts with slavery, and two, are sanitized accounts of civil rights, quote unquote, leaders. And so folks talk about Dr. King in these really glowing terms when really the government had labeled him as a terrorist. Like, no one was rocking with Dr. King like 60, 70 years ago. So it's problematic. And so, yes, I believe we need Black History Month because I think of it kind of like a birthday. You clearly, we are celebrated and we walk around this earth all year round. But our birthday is the day that we shine a spotlight on who we are, where we literally we're celebrating our life and legacy, however short or long that it is. That's what Black History Month is. But unfortunately in America, Black History Month has been the month that is relegated to, this is the only time we talk about and celebrate the contributions of Black people to this country. And depending on where you are, we talk about them in very sanitized and whitewashed ways. In schools, we are not teaching Black history. And that's problematic when Black history is American history. And so to have a course of American history where you don't truly talk about the contributions of Black people in this country and prior to this country contributes to the current systems of inequality that we all fight to eradicate. But when you don't understand that, that's literally how it's set up, it's you ask questions like, well, how could people say X, Y, and Z? Well, because we're not teaching real history in our schools. And then in our outside groups and organizations, we don't know the real history to get it taught either. So when we come to the work not from a place of real knowledge, I think that's where we do ourselves a disservice. Okay, let's have a conversation. I want to set the stage. Thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Oh, shout out to Go Big Red. Go Big Red.
And I grew up in a very privileged life. And the police are our friends. And I've been dating a Black man for the last 10 years. And it's a whole different world. It's a world that I had no idea. And I think most white people don't understand the reality of everyday life for somebody who's not in the majority. The guy that I go to at the farmer's market treats me one way when I'm by myself, and I'm with my boyfriend, I get treated a whole different way. He's been stopped by the police so many times, he doesn't drink, he doesn't do drugs, he's never gotten a ticket, but he's been stopped by the police in the last 10 years probably 20 times. And I think that a lot of white people don't understand that it's a whole different world for people of color out there.
That's true. So, I did a inclusion and strategies training with a company in Silicon Valley a couple weeks ago. And at the end of the training, a woman gets up and she basically asked, because I said the thing about don't tell me about you colorblind. Like, that's something you should just stop saying, everyone. So she gets up at the end of the session and she's like, what are some other things I as a white person should not say? And I was training with someone from the Mary Frances Winters group, who is a good friend of mine, who's non-melanated. And he looks at me, he's like, Symone, I think that's a question for you. And I say, well, the answer is really this. Like, I don't want you to think that there's like a litany. This is what I told her. I was like, I don't want you to think there's like a litany of things that you can't say, and if I give you these like 6 bullet points, like you're good. because it doesn't work like that. But I do think that it's important to understand, and that non-melanated folks, non-people of color in this country should understand that they navigate the world differently than people of color do. That as a person of color, I never have had the privilege to show up and just say, I don't know. And so I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, and I went to Catholic school my entire life. My Catholic grade school was 99% African American, but my high school and then my collegiate experience was like 3%, 2%, sometimes 1% people of color. And so I lived in the predominantly African American part of the city in Omaha. So when I went to high school, to be frank, that was the first time that I had truly been around white people en masse. Because if I'm activating in my own community in North Omaha, I'm around mostly black folks. If I'm going to school, I'm around mostly black folks. My teachers were not African American, but the people that I went to school with. But when I went to high school, that was the first time where I was in a learning environment where I was actually the minority. It would have never been acceptable for me to say, oh, I've never gone to school with white people before, so I'm just ignorant of X, Y, and Z. For a person of color in America, it is never acceptable to say, well, I've never, been around X, Y, and Z before. I've never been with white people before, so I just didn't know. But for non-people of color in America, the default is, oh, well, I've never experienced X, Y, and Z. Instead of working to understand the experience. And I think the history of this country and how we have been conditioned plays into that. And so for so many people in America, you've never had to look outside of your own lived experience. I look outside of my own lived experience every single day because that's how I survive. But again, when we don't have intentional conversations about how we navigate the world, this is how we get caught up. So then we get in personal and professional situations where folks are like, I've never had to experience X, Y, and Z. And sometimes folks whose voices have been marginalized in the conversation, that is why we can't sometimes get to the real work. Because there's so many people that carry some bit of animosity about the fact that there are, again, people in this country that have the privilege and the luxury of not having to think about navigating the world any other kind of way. And I think that is something that folks should really take time to reflect on, especially in the work that you all do. Because every single day, people of color in this country have to think about navigating the world outside of themselves. But if you are not a person of color, that's not something you've ever been forced to do. Yes, ma'am. Here, and then we'll go here. Yes, ma'am.
So you talked a little bit about the fact that we've never, in this country, actually reckoned with our history. And I feel pretty strongly that in order to actually move forward towards liberation, we really do have to have that. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on what truth and reconciliation and a real reckoning, beyond just sort of first talking about what history is for real to start, and then what does it look like to move forward and have a reckoning of that kind?
So I'll talk to you about what some things that are out there that people are hypothesizing on. This is not something that I necessarily subscribe to. But for instance, there is every single year since John Conyers has been in office, Congressman John Conyers, who's now retiring, has been in office as a Democrat from the 13th Congressional District in Michigan. He has introduced legislation to establish a commission to study the idea of reparations for black people in America. And every single year, the bill doesn't get out of committee. Now there's layers to that because at one point, Democrats were in the majority, and the committee they would go through, he was in charge of. So, okay, just so we're all on the same page. But the idea of reparations is one form that could be taken to address that. The problem is, if you will, that when you say the term reparations, people automatically think of a financial handout. And there are levels to reparations, but we can't even talk about reparations for Black people in America, I think, without actually establishing something to study, like what that would look like. We need recommendations for what types of reparations would take place. You have some people, like former President Barack Obama, is someone that subscribes to the fact, well, affirmative action type programs are indeed a form of reparations. And that we don't need a commission to study reparations and the recommendations on what reparations should actually be, what form they should actually take, because we have reparations right now. I don't necessarily think I subscribe to that idea, but I think it's an interesting concept. So I think reparations in general is the answer to that, but the question is, what does reparations look like? And in my opinion, it is not simply a financial handout, because if you give me a certain amount of X amount of thousands of dollars, it's going to be gone tomorrow. I like to shop. I like to, I'm going to be honest. So I think reparations is one part of that, but what does reparations look like? What if we instituted a quota, this is a radical concept, quota programs for like the federal government, like our elected officials. Quotas. These are all very radical concepts. You had a question.
Yeah, so this is many layers. I'll try to not complicate it, but so I'm interested in doing school social work. Thank you. And as a background, hello?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm interested in doing school social work. And just kind of as a background, at the YWCA conference that was here in, I think it was like October, there was a man named Eddie Moore Jr. He's in Milwaukee, and he wrote a book in collaboration with some teachers called A Guide for White Women Who Teach Black Boys. And he was talking about, within his talk, the need for representing, Black leaders within our classrooms. And a lot of the times, I have tons of friends that are within the education department here that are trying to be teachers. And the fact of the matter is, our education system, the teachers that are teaching the future teachers, are not teaching those things. They're not representing those people. They're not integrating it into their curriculum or making it a requirement to represent those people. And I guess, as a school social worker, I feel like it's my responsibility to advocate for those students that not only have troubles at home or whatever, but the students of color that have all of these things, and on top of that go to a school that doesn't represent them in the way that they should be represented, or show them the people that make them who they are and have helped them get to where they are today, and allow them to be where they are, or set it up so they can be where they are. And so I guess my question, or I hope that we can talk about the best way for, you say that you're in these meetings where we're trying to come up with solutions for students or for individuals or kids within the juvenile justice system that, and they're not a part of the conversation. Within school social work, I wonder how we can best do that, especially as a white woman who will be dealing or will be working with and serving communities of color in the future. So I just kind of wanted to bring that up and have a conversation about that, if you had anything to add.
So I want to ask the folks a question. We're in Wisconsin. This is an issue across the board in the state, is it not? Is it? Yeah. Tell me, just shout out some examples or some other things, like. Yes, within the education system. Lack of funding. What else? Too many kids in one classroom, suspension rates. What else? Segregated schools. Ooh. Push out. What else? Police in schools, white flight. Removal of funding. I've never had a teacher of color in my entire educational experience. I've never had a teacher of color. My Spanish teacher was from Argentina. She was from Argentina, but that was my only teacher of color I've ever had. Okay, so I like to use, so the education system is just really messed up everywhere across America. It's very shitty. And I think part of when we talk about reform and changes, some of it is that, for instance, if we have folks who are being trained up as future educators and they are not reflective of the folks that they're teaching, but they need to be educated on something, they need to introduce these other pieces, and because they probably got this messed up American history that doesn't include people of color history in the American history, we have to introduce new people to the table. So when I talk about the juvenile justice work that I did, and literally, once I started showing up to the meetings, I was like, we got to bring some other people in here. So I literally brought system-involved people to all the meetings. System-involved young people wrote the 2013 recommendations for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention that were given to the White House, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and Congress. They were authored by system-involved young people. That was a fight, but they authored it. And then at least 6 other recommendations were adopted and are currently being implemented today. Well, they were. I don't know about this, so JJD. But I absolutely believe we have to be very intentional about putting people at the table, but these accomplices also matter. So if funding is an issue, how can we be innovative about the way we get money? And perhaps the funding, if we're being innovative about how we get funds, clearly the money isn't going to come from the state, so it can't fund the actual whole school system, but maybe we get an outside donor that's going to fund a program that teaches the history that's not being taught. Maybe we get an outside donor that's going to fund an initiative. Because we have to get really creative, because again, the systems, as y'all know, it's a lot of red tape. If it's the police and schools issue, it's for lack of a better term, it's a hot button issue right now. And so how do we get, the NFL just launched the Let's Listen initiative. That's all about addressing racial inequality and police community relations. So how can communities go out there, because the NFL is real hungry for some good press, because I know. They called me, I was like, y'all. So is there an opportunity for communities, if you are a state that has a football team, to partner with the NFL's Let's Listen initiative, because they do have funds that are available? This is what I'm talking about when we're being bold, radical, and revolutionary. We have to get really creative about how we can serve the folks that we're supposed to serve. Because if we think about it just in traditional ways, we're stuck, we hit a wall. So those are some of the initial things that I would say. Yes, Mia.
Similar to that, I guess, there's a lot of, I would say, white saviors in social work. And they're well-meaning people. We want to do the right thing. But how do we get people to the table that need to be at the table in these roles? Versus, investing in communities versus people trying to fix people. Because it's not about fixing people, it's about people lifting themselves up.
Investing in community.
Yeah, investing in people.
I would be interested to know if anyone in this room has had success with what she just mentioned. If anybody in this room has had success in a true community partnership and has seen success in a true community investment. Or I would also like to hear if folks do think this, quote unquote, if they have had experience with this, quote unquote, white savior complex, and they have not seen success with the communities that they're engaging in. I'd like to hear a story or two about that. So is there anybody that could raise their hand, even if you don't want to say anything, that has seen success with a true community investment program? Yes, ma'am.
So I'm from Milwaukee, and I don't know if folks heard about the Red Cross pulling out of certain neighborhoods in Milwaukee.
Well, the Red Cross is problematic, but I hope it ain't nobody from well, if it is somebody in the Red Cross in here, y'all got some issues.
So in response to to that, there was a community uprising, and it was sponsored by the Black Chamber of Commerce and other community leaders that general, like, white people would not see as community leaders. I think that's part of the problem, is not recognizing that there are community leaders that look in different ways than our political government. But so there was a community uprising and a meeting with about 50 people from those neighborhoods that came together, and they formed what is happening in Houston, Texas as well. It's called the Black Cross. And so they have pooled together and are currently doing that, pooling together money for disasters that happen in the neighborhoods and are responding to that. So I went to that meeting because I am part of the structure that works with the homeless service delivery system to see how I could support. But my role was to sit back and see what kind of connection, if any, needed to be made. And the service delivery system, because they were talking about homelessness and fires and that causes homelessness, that wasn't needed. The people figured it out. And I think supporting that and sitting back is really, that was my experience with this instance, that getting the system out of the way was what actually needed to happen. So because this other system was working.
That takes like a real humility, I think, to recognize that. I think a lot of funders and people that want to be in positions of power can't take a step
Back to let people do the work that they need to do because of their own ego. So, like, I get frustrated when we don't invest in people to do the work that they can do. Why don't we fund the people that know the problems, know what they need? It's a really messed up system. Frustrating.
So I think, so right now, nationally, especially with like the more progressive funder circles, like there is an interest to fund good initiatives. But the problem is that there's so many initiatives out there, right? And so I was just at a thing with some funder folks last week, and one of the things that they were saying is that they want to fund projects where there is a demonstrated, like a clear line down to the community. And they want to see stronger proposals, if you will. And if that's what and I mean, these were some like good, like strong, heavy hitter folks. And I would venture to say that local folks in Wisconsin are saying the same thing. And so I guess the approach is not that like this is what we should be doing because da-da-da-da, but like our proposal is stronger. Sometimes you have to attack it from a financial standpoint when we're talking about this work with, you know, the powers that be in our very fancy spaces and places. And so I think part of it is just like strong proposals. What gets you better money is a clear line to the community. But the issue is some people don't want to give the money and invest in people because they have not found credible community partners on the ground. And they've been burned with investing in people. So they've invested in some people and they gave somebody $100,000 and you can't tell, the people that they gave the money to can't tell you what they did. And so now they're like, oh, we're not giving any more money to the so-and-so, we're gonna do it because we want to be able to control the purse strings. And so it's about finding really credible community partners. And I would say not just giving money away or giving to whatever people are already doing, but what can you build together? Again, sometimes it's providing infrastructure for the work. Sometimes there's no work, but there's infrastructure. I think that's how we should think about it. And if you approach it in that vein and you find really good, credible community partners, because sometimes you can't work with everybody. Everybody in the community ain't ready to be a partner. Sometimes the community is going to take your money. But for the people in the community that do want to be really, really good, credible partners, the people that do have some semblance of the work already happening or some real infrastructure through the work can be channeled through, what does a partnership look like? And I don't think we ask enough what a partnership looks like. We say, this is what we want to do. We don't ask what a partnership looks like. We need to start asking what a partnership looks like. We'll go here, and then we'll go back there.
I just want to say you asked about the community partnerships, and it is important to include the community instead of coming in and saying, we're going to fix you because whatever you're doing is wrong. That happened, I was working at Children's Hospital, it was pretty big in Milwaukee, and they had developed a community they were making all these decisions. This is what we're gonna do, this is how we're gonna fix the problem, this is what's gonna happen. And I'm sitting here, all these executives and all these leaders are there, and I'm thinking, nobody sees this? Nobody sees that something is missing? How do you come in from the outside and tell the community we're gonna fix you? And then what happens, you don't communicate with the community to identify what they see as a problem. You identify the problem, then you wonder why it doesn't work. And so when we did that, I brought it up, and thank God that they were listening. Our next meeting was to get community individuals to come in.
Because most often people don't know. Like it's a lot of times this isn't done like, lots of people benefit from white supremacy, but the majority of people are not white supremacists. Ooh, write that down. Lots of people benefit from white supremacy, but the majority of people are not white supremacists. But they're benefiting, they're perpetuating these systems every single day, and sometimes it takes somebody piping up in the meeting saying, hey, you know, I feel, help me understand, because I think this is problematic. I'm a help me understand kind of girl. When I don't want to be antagonistic, I'm like, you know, that's interesting. Can you help me understand? Because I think blah, 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 but help me understand why you're saying this, because I want to unpack this. And I think we need to be sometimes help me understand people. And that's a lot of times we aren't help me understand people. We're like, oh my goodness, these folks ain't, they ain't really here for the community, da 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 da. People we work with just don't get it. But a lot of times it's not that they are actively or knowingly, consciously perpetuating this system that we call a system of white supremacy. It is like an unconscious thing. Again, because a lot of folks that engage in the work that we're talking about are not necessarily on a large scale, are not people of color. And so they have never had to we just talked about it, have never had to navigate the world, thinking about navigating the world differently. And so when you take a moment to step back and engage in a help me understand conversation, that is how it's just one or two tweaks to the program that make a big difference. Yes, ma'am.
So a couple of things occur to me. One, you asked about success story. I am involved with Nuestro Mundo Community School, Nuestro Mundo Incorporated here in Madison, which has now about 14-year history of providing dual language immersion Spanish-English for kids from kindergarten through 5th grade, but also supporting the school district's effort to have it through middle school and into high school. We had our first cohort graduate last year. The reason I bring this up is, or it occurred to me to share with everybody, is you asked, how do we have, or is there an example of a success where we brought the community together? And I would say in all my years having been involved with organizing around this effort and the school, we have made some changes in our community, but it's an everyday struggle to include all the players at the table. And in part because agendas over the years shift, people's engagement shifts, the effort, while it was a grassroots effort, literally a couple of people came together, just as you described, Dr. King, who's gonna, we've got kids that aren't graduating, look at these awful rates, how can we address this? A couple people came together, and then a couple people more, and a couple people more in living rooms, and 14 years later, we've got a school, a successful school. But not everybody wants to be engaged in the same way. Sometimes I struggle with I don't think it's our intention, but sometimes it comes across when we have these conversations sort of monolithically, like we are good people or we're not good people, and that intersectionality that you talk about, the nuanced complexity of what brings us to the work and what's our agenda and how is it going to benefit us, and then how do we, even beyond that, beyond getting the money to start the effort, this is where I'm at, sustainability, continued success, continued demonstration of importance and validity and necessity. Because 14 years into it, people are now like, ooh, we've had that forever. We don't need to ask that question anymore. It's going to be here forever. And they forget that it was a struggle to get it, and it's a struggle to maintain it, and it's going to be a struggle to continue to move it forward to improve. So those are the two things, the idea of like the monolith and then sustainability. That's share my story, but I wonder if you have any comments about that.
How many folks as organizations are engaged in strategic planning like past 5 years? Ooh, raise them high. Okay, 10-year strategic plans? How many folks' organizations have strategic plans around the work for 10 years? Ooh, where you work?
More like 5. I can't back down.
There you go. So, while yes, there is a real challenge, like there is something to be said about planning 10, 15 years down the road when there are clearly contributing factors. But I think a lot of the problems of the social justice spaces and the like community partnership spaces is that there's no long-term strategic planning past, usually it's like 5, sometimes 7. But businesses and corporations and other formal entities will tell you they have a 20-year strategic plan that is flexible, but there is a plan. They have literally laid out like what the goal is. And I would venture to say that more organizations and groups need to engage in truly long-term strategic planning. Because if, 15 years from now, if we've had a 20-year strategic plan, like we have something we can continuously go back to, reference, tweak, and whatever. The issue is that, 14 years ago, there was a 5-year strategic plan. And now, 14 years later, we're like, oh, well, we don't even need, because there was even, no one even conceptualized that 14 years later, like this would be a part of the fabric of what we're doing. And that's problematic. And that's why so many of our initiatives and the good work that we're doing is not sustainable, because we also don't have really great pipeline programs. And so there's a lot of times there's turnover in the work that we do. Or there was one person that had been doing a thing for 25 years, and then they retire, and they have been so entrenched in the work that they didn't necessarily build up or give their institutional knowledge to anybody else. There wasn't a long-term strategic plan. And so now we're asking people to be innovative and radical in the work, and they don't even know what's been done. And so we have to push ourselves, our institutions, and our organizations to being radical is making a 20-year strategic plan. And maybe it's not for your whole organization. Maybe you start with it's for this initiative. But that's part of that radical revolutionary work. It's not necessarily really sexy, but 20 years from now, when your program is still flourishing and you're the only one still being funded, I bet you it's going to make a difference. We're going to go right here, and then we'll go here and here.
Thank you. So I started taking social work classes this year, and it's become abundantly clear to me that social work really needs to be done with people who are in power. It's, a lot of the question is what's wrong with the world, or what are the ills that we're trying to fix, and quote unquote. And what's clear to me is it's how policies are shaking down, and then people are responding and doing the best that they can with what's available to them. So how do we make policy less boring and and engaging for people to get on a platform or clear sort of recommendations and have build momentum around that type of thing to influence policy, influence larger picture changes without sort of changing the channel every 20 seconds.
How many people would like to make the policy less boring to get more people on board? Look, y'all, the issue is, when I first went to work in Washington, D.C., I went to work for a consumer advocacy think tank in their trade division. I worked for Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, and I managed the campaigns for their local, national, and international media campaigns all around free and fair and open trade policies that are not written by corporations. I'm like a real lefty. And when I went to go work at the organization, my first day, I sat in a meeting, and people were using all these acronyms. And no one had given me a book to tell me what the acronyms were. I was like, wait, what is the TPA, what? The TISA, the TPP this, the TPP that, the fast track this, fast track that. And the language that folks were using in the progressive trade movement, especially when we would go to these meetings, was not language that I readily identified with. So I struggled my first 3 months at the organization. Everything I wrote would come back with red all over it, because I wasn't hip to the terminology. Like the language that they were using wasn't language that spoke to me. So I had to get real hip with the language real quick, because I wanted to keep that real job. So think when we talk about like engaging the community though, the problem is a lot of times we are using language and talking about policies like all the way up here. In the juvenile justice work, we would go to the meetings and they would be talking about the policies up here. And I was never, because I was the person at the table like, well, what does that mean? Can we use layman's terms? And I think we need to have divisions or somebody in our office that does the work of the translation of the policy. We need an interpreter for the community to interpret the policy into language that is a general understanding for anybody, so that someone that comes to this with no knowledge of it is able to understand what we're talking about. And I'll use an example of net neutrality. And so the issue of net neutrality, so net neutrality was effectively ended by an FCC vote a couple months ago. And I like to explain net neutrality because it's a complicated concept for some people. Like you know, net neutrality is like water. So right now, you pay a fee to the water company, and as long as you pay your water bill, your water comes on. You can get water at 6 p.m., at 10 p.m. You can get water in your bathroom, in the kitchen, in the holes outside to water your grass. And you on this block have the same kind of water that Tina down the street has, and has the same kind of water that the people in the rich part of the city have, probably. Unless you live in Flint, which is a whole nother story. But in general, like, we all have access to water as long as we pay our general water bill. What net neutrality did, when ending net neutrality, it gave the water company the ability to decide, you know what? Between the hours of 6 and 10 p.m., I just ain't gonna give you water anymore. Your water is shut off. But for extra fee, you can have water between 6 and 10 p.m. I'm gonna slow the water down. It gave every single water company across the country the ability to individually regulate your water. And so now, you know, in the morning in this neighborhood, I'm going to slow the water down. And for people that pay a little bit more over here in this package, I'm gonna give you more water. And matter of fact, actually, we're a company that says between 12 and 1 a.m., no water at all. I don't care who you are. And nobody can tell us what to do about it. That's how I like to explain net neutrality. That's what happened to the internet. And so now the internet, individual companies can say, you know what, between you're with Comcast, you're with us Comcast, great. Well, we don't want to offer this particular package and channel to you. And we will never offer it. We will never carry it, and no one can make us do it. Oh, you want to have Netflix? Well, we don't like Netflix. No. You want to be on Twitter? It's going to cost you an extra $5.95 an hour if you'd like to access Twitter. An open free Google search? Great. Not if you live in this part of the country. That's what net neutrality did. But that's how I've literally been going around explaining net neutrality. It's like if the water companies got to individually regulate your stuff. That's how we have to think about. We have to think about like practical ways to break down these policies to various communities so that they understand. Because a lot of this stuff is real complicated. Some days I don't understand. I'll be calling the lawyers like, can y'all tell me about this one more time? Give it to me in layman's terms. Because I don't know what this means. And the way bills are written are specifically written so that we don't understand. Because there's so much crap in the dang on bill. They don't want you, in the DJ Khaled voice, they don't want you to understand the bill. So we gotta interpret the policies for the community and then literally give the community talking points. Like, that's how this works. Yes, sir.
I want to begin with a comment about how I feel like very often the mainstream, especially the liberal mainstream, will use the word community as a euphemism for Black and brown people. Well, in reality, communities are made up of all kinds of people. I mean, we have white rural communities that get completely left out of that conversation. Now, to take it back to the historical perspective that you were taking earlier in your presentation, I am fascinated by the Civil War and Reconstruction. I think that era was so pivotal in the construction of our national identity, at least as it is today. And you had mentioned something about the perpetrators of the treason not being punished. And I agree with that. I think that the perpetrators of the treason, however, were people in the upper class, the aristocracy of the South. And that revolution was also fueled by people on the ground, people in the lower classes who were white. Those people received a lot of punishment during the Civil War. There were people's livelihoods destroyed. A lot of people died in that war. And I just see a parallel with today between the animosity between those two classes, the white and the black classes, underneath the middle class, underneath the aristocracy, underneath the upper class, whatever you want to call it. And that being a major stumbling block on the road to progressivism, progressive policy. And so I was wondering if you could, one, sort of speak a little bit to that. Do you think I'm right in my historical perspective? And if so, do you think that there's a parallel with today?
Yes, I do think you're right in your historical perspective. Today, though, so I talked about, I made a quip about working class white people earlier. And so I like to talk about Dr. King because Dr. King's Poor People campaign was literally about like the lack of economic equity across the board, whether people were white, black, Native American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, or otherwise. That if you were poor, it doesn't matter like how many civil liberties, how free we think we are. If you are still poor, you are still hampered in this country, and you cannot achieve your full potential. Like Dr. King's real dream was for folks not to just be able to sit at the lunch counter, but be able and buy a hamburger, but be able to own the establishment. That's what it was really about. That's why we ain't been in mountaintop. So I would say today, the issue is that poor people in this country do not view themselves like as a block. That if you are poor and white in this country, in some places you're still better than being poor and black. You're still better than being poor and Latino. You're still better you're still better than being poor and Asian American, Pacific Islander. And therein lies the issue, is that we have allowed this rhetoric of the last, I would say, 10, 15 years, maybe even longer. But we've allowed the rhetoric to make us feel as though folks in McDowell County, West Virginia, or folks in the suburbs of Madison, or even the poor white parts of Madison, are dealing with different issues than black people in Milwaukee. When in all actuality, they got the same issues. We're just talking about them differently. And I think the way that we combat that is we need a new age poor people's campaign. But it's tough when folks are viewing it through these divisive racial lenses. Like that's essentially, Donald Trump was not wrong when he said that there's a forgotten man. And to be frank, because over the last 50, 60 years, everybody has moved upwards in some way, shape, or form in America, but white men. Like that's not an incorrect statement to make. If you're a woman and a woman of color, if you're a person of color, or if you're a man or a person of color, like straight white men ain't necessarily going nowhere. That's not an incorrect statement to make. But if you but you have to address the conversation, at least acknowledging that. So for a real reality for a lot of people in this country is that, what is progressive for some people means that like I get less. And if you've always been in power, what do they say? Equality or equity feels like oppression. That goes back to these intentional conversations. But I fully believe that we have to attack the issue of economic inequality, understanding that yes, there are specific barriers to why there are the wealth gap for black families is so much larger than the wealth gap for like white people. But that poor people across the board have more in common than they do different. And we can talk about our differences, but still be on the same team, unite under this poor people's campaign. But we're not there because of this hyper sensitive rhetoric and the entrenched idea for a lot of people that they are still better than those other poor people. And fixing that is some folks getting together and having a conversation that I can't have. I can't have the conversation with the poor white people that think they're better than the poor black people. That's some conversation for some white people to go have with other white people, to be frank. There's some intra-black people conversations we gotta have. You can't have the intra-black people conversations. I gotta go over there and have those. But there's a real conversation that needs to be had within the quote-unquote white community. White people always talk about, where's our white community? Here it is. There's a real conversation that needs to be had amongst white people, and progressive white accomplices are the folks, in my opinion, that should be leading the charge on these conversations around breaking down those barriers. Because It's just a fact that I cannot go into those communities and break down the barriers. I can go in and have a conversation and get to a place of understanding, but the messenger matters.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Mm-hmm.
How, like, in those conversations that you're proposing, do you have any insights into how we should use rhetoric to help people understand that it's not a zero-sum game? That somebody, a black poor person, doing better does not mean that poor white person you're talking to is going to do worse. How do you get them to understand that? Because I think people's minds immediately go to that. He's doing better, I'm going to do worse. Zero-sum game.
I think acknowledging that, yes, essentially everybody in this country has moved in the last 50, 60 years except straight white men is important in those conversations. Because it's the understanding that you at least get where you get the perspective that folks are coming from. And I think we should approach these conversations not initially hoping to change someone's mind. This is about understanding. And the problem with our current political climate and our rhetoric is that we are currently engaging in conversations that are literally battles. I was on TV last night, the battle coming up next. And they hype it up as a battle. We're not to a place where we want to understand where you're coming from and what your perspective is, and then I'm going to give you my perspective, and then I can make a point where you kind of agree with that. I haven't changed your mind yet, but we agree, and I agree with you. We need to get to a place of understanding, and so it's going into having these conversations to first get to a place of understanding. Why do you feel the way that you feel? What fuels this perspective? And that's where we literally have to start. And this is a series of conversations that happens over time. This isn't one or two really good mind-blowing conversations and then the tide has changed. So you have to first get to a place of understanding to where then you can introduce new things into the conversation, with said person or people that you're speaking with, to get them to a place where their mind is maybe a little bit more open. Because I just told you in the beginning, there's so many people that are operating in this world that are ignorant to the fact that people of color have to navigate the world differently. And so if you are someone that is ignorant of the fact that people of color navigate this world differently, on top of having these additional views about how you are essentially being robbed financially or economically or by upward mobility by these other people whom you have no real understanding of how they navigate the world, I can't have a conversation with you about being open and progressive. Because progressive to you is a dirty word. Let me check our time. Okay. We will wait. I think I was here, and then we'll go here, here, and then we'll pop back up to here.
Thank you for everything you've said today. My question is this: when I'm thinking about intersectionality and also the conversation around history, how those come together to form identity in a new generation is something that's on my mind a lot. Mm-hmm. And so to make that more concrete, so I'm in a family, we're biracial, we're bilingual, my husband's both black and an immigrant, and we're raising kids. And it's interesting, even at kids who are very young, I think of my son, who has very clear ideas about who he is. And he'll say, I'm white, and I'm this, and I'm that. And there's a lot of privilege to the way he talks about himself, and yet, who am I to tell him who he is or who he's not? And I think we're really intentional in our family about bringing up different histories, how our marriage would have been illegal 50, 60 years ago, the Loving case, and people know a little bit about that because of the movie, but not because it's affected them personally. So I'm wondering how you talk to a new generation of kids who are increasingly have these intersectional identities, which is growing over time. My husband and I talk a lot about how divided we are as a country, and yet we can't stop loving each other, and that keeps happening. You see more biracial couples now than you've ever seen before. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that, the new identities that are emerging all the time, and how what role we play. I don't want to tell my son who he is or who he's not, and yet he has a lot of history to reconcile with over time.
I have a question. Looking at your son, would someone say he was a person of color?
He looks more white than he does black, because my husband's black. But I look at my stepson, who's older, and now lives in a tropical climate where he's exposed to the sun a lot, and he looks more black. He looks a little more brown.
So this is interesting because we, again, some of us are real progressive, okay? And there are pockets in America where we just real progressive. We live in extra progressive lives, and I love it. But the reality is that our institutions in the world have yet to catch up to our real progressive pockets. And in a world where there are young people who are experiencing the world with multiple identities, it is important that they, one, understand who they are, but two, understand how the world views them. And who you say you are is sometimes very different than how the world views you. And it's important for you to have an understanding of both, because for some kids, the latter could be the difference between them coming home at night or not. And I think those are the types of conversations we have to have with this burgeoning group of young people, this burgeoning group of generations that are extremely intersectional in their identities and their thought process, just very innovative and real, we don't like boxes. Over 45% of millennials identify as independents. And that matters because that lends to the other ways that they engage and see the world. And so young people that are increasingly more saying that they're spiritual, not necessarily religious. Folks that don't want to participate in traditional institutions, so on and so forth. And that's great. I love it. But the reality is that the world has not yet caught up to where we are. And if we do not have, again, intentional conversations about how the world views our young people, how the world views a lot of our kids, we're doing them a disservice. They're not going to be able to survive. I think about the 300 kids I was telling you about that were literally not feeling me in those 3 rows. The children were a part of a group called Jack and Jill. And I don't know if folks in this room are familiar with Jack and Jill, but the Jack and Jill of America is kind of what I would view as a upper echelon program for African American families and African American families. And so it's upper echelon program for more well-to-do, upper middle class, young black kids. And they do all these innovative programs together. They're doing chala, all this kind of stuff. They're gonna do it pageants. They're just amazing. And their parents are doctors and lawyers and TV execs and folks whom they participated in Jack and Jill. And so these are very privileged young people, very privileged black kids. And so in this session that we were doing, we were talking about racial inequality. And the parents are in the room, and in the Q&A, one of the parents says, I still don't understand why our kids need to be the ones having this conversation. And what I told them is that your privilege will not protect you, and your kids need to know that. And so we talk about working with underserved communities and urban kids and whatnot, but there's also a larger conversation to be had about kids of color in general, to where people do not care who your mama is, who your daddy is, where you work, where you went to school, how much money y'all have, and what kind of car they drive. When you walk out there in the world, you just black. You just Latino. You just a person of color. And if we don't understand that is the lens through which the world is viewing the kids that we are working with and engaging with every single day, through the kids that are in our own households, that's real problematic. Because, then your son comes home one day and he don't understand why the police pulled him over. Doesn't understand why they were talking to him real rough. Because you thought she was white. I'm just saying. That's very real. And we have to have those conversations. I'm going to do 2 more questions. And then if folks would like to take some photos, we can do that. And then I have to leave.
Okay, my question to you is, are there any political movements or any political agendas that are dealing with the real terrorists in this United States of America? Because today I can't understand how the white supremacist groups can do what they do and get away with it. I think in moving forward in this country and healing a lot of the harms that have been done to people of color, women's groups. I mean, just a lot of things that have been done over time. I think there needs to be a healing, and I think there needs to be a holding accountable for behaviors, because if I go out and do that, or if a group of my friends that went out and did what they did, we would be shot, dead, jailed, and in prison. I don't know, jailed, prison, same thing, but we would be treated differently. So how is it that these groups can continue to do this? And are there any movements that are dealing with holding people accountable? Because if we can't hold them accountable, then all the work that we do here is for naught almost, because we're putting a Band-Aid over, a societal ill that hasn't been dealt with. Are there any political agendas or initiatives that are, growing or developing now that you are aware of that are, looking at that?
No. So last year, the Trump administration removed white supremacists from the list of terror organizations that they monitor domestically. Y'all better get off that cable news, I'll tell you. Yes, they removed white supremacist groups from the list of terror organizations that they monitor. They removed them. And this was pre-Charlottesville. And so when the institution has literally abdicated their responsibility for this work, but no one rings even the smallest bell of an alarm, that is how this is allowed to operate underground. And then something happens, and then we're like, oh, we have to do something about the white supremacists. And I'm like, we take our eye off the ball of the work. And so there are some, I would say there's some very small political factions that, outside, more radicalized folks that are having very interesting preliminary conversations about how to combat this issue. But the truth of the matter is, white supremacy has literally killed people in this country. Outside groups of multicultural coalitions trying to hold the white supremacists accountable will be gunned down and shot and killed. Because that's what history teaches us, because that's what happened before. It was when the government stepped in with all its fancy spaces and places and bells and whistles and decided to aid and abet in this work that folks curbed their enthusiasm. So I would definitely encourage people to take a look at the Department of Justice's priorities and the things that they have rolled back and decided to activate on, and see what kind of organizing we can do around that to force our government to hold these folks accountable. Because neo-Nazis and white nationalists and domestic terror, the KKK are the original domestic terrorists. But again, when we don't know the history, when we don't know what has happened and what's been rolled back, it's really hard for us to have a intentional conversation about engagement. My last question.
First, I just want to say thank you for all the wisdom that you've shared. I want to say, as somebody who's about to turn 28, you're making me feel like I really need to get my shit together. So thank you again just for being here, for everything that you've shared today.
Well, I still can't make a flight on time, so we're even. Okay, I got issues going to the airport.
We all have improvements to make here and there anyway. But so I guess actually my question is sort of one 20-something to another. I see that you sort of proclaim your millennial identity as well as part of what you talk about, and I just want to know, do you notice, how does that play into the work that you do? Do you notice an anti-millennialness in the racial justice field, in the movement, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, so I do notice that oftentimes I'm the youngest person in the room. Nowadays, there's at least maybe one person a little younger than me, and I'm like, I'm seasoned now. But I do, yeah, there's always, I think, just a kind of a hint of when young people step up and have something to say, because I think seasoned folks that have been in the trenches doing the work want their contributions to be respected. And when young people like myself pop up and start talking about we need to be innovative and creative and this ain't your grandmama's civil rights movement, it's to a certain level that is disrespectful to the work that has come before us. Like, I'm only able to I talk about being your authentic self a lot of times when I do a lot of college campuses. And like a year ago, this lady had one of the old, I'm a member of the Links Incorporated, one of the old Links had to come check me. She's like, you are only able to be your authentic self because I could not be mine. And I was like, you're absolutely right. And I have to understand that, like, my ability to like present and show up as my authentic self every single day as a young person, as a young woman of color, as a black person is only possible because there were so many people that came before. Like, we can sit in this room and have this conversation because there were so many people that came before us that could not sit in these rooms, that could not engage in these conversations, but pushed through and plowed through anyway. Like, we have a Me Too movement, ladies, because there were so many women that could not even form the words to say Me Too. And so I also come, like, present and show up understanding that. But I really do believe that in all the major movements in history, like, young people have been a key part of them. And part of it is because we come to this really fresh. We haven't been in it for 20, 30 years. And we are looking at it with a fresh set of eyes. And sometimes when you get a fresh set of eyes on something, you can see something just a little bit differently. So that's why I advocate for young people in the room. I'm going to always be the person that's pulling more young people in the room. I have to, because now I've been in it for a little while, and I need a fresh pair of eyes. I need somebody to tell me that, I'm getting a little establishment, okay? Because young people are the only people that have ever helped push us to help save the world. They literally have. And it's okay for us to recognize that. But yes, I have encountered challenges. There are definitely people that, tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. There are literally times where I have sat in meetings and said things and folks are like, that is absolutely not true. And then I go and I make the team fund the research to prove what I'm saying is correct so I can circle back and be like, well, now I have the paperwork because you only look at the data. I was right. But these are definitely interesting times for young people. And so for all of you that work with young people, for all of the proverbial young people in the room and actual young people in the room, I think it's important that we truly understand that, like, this is our moment. This is our intergenerational moment, and the work that we are doing right now will define what life looks like for folks 60 years from now. Much like the work that young people 60 years ago did defines the work that we do, the life that we live right now. And because that is true, it is imperative that young people, that millennials, that unlikely spokespeople stand up, raise up, and, like, push to put themselves at the table. And sometimes we're going to experience animosity. Folks are like, how do we get more young people engaged and involved? Sometimes y'all need to move out the way and let young people lead. But young people, sometimes you don't need to just be waiting on somebody to come pick you and tell you what to do. You need to actively show up and engage on your own and be a real credible intergenerational partner with these seasoned folk that did all the work so that you could sit in the room. So that's how I think about the work, and that is the reason that I am able to sit here today and have just a very thought-provoking conversation with you all. Y'all, I'm drained. Y'all have just drained me out. And I think I just want to thank y'all for the work that you are doing every single day. Like, folks are always like, oh, most heroes don't wear capes. They don't. A lot of them are social workers. They're teachers. They are practitioners. They are folks that work in Dane County that's advocating for the people when everybody else in the meeting don't want to say it. So I appreciate the work that y'all do. The work that you do is vital and it's important. And right now in this moment, we cannot get tired. And that may sound like frou-frou language, but it's so true. Because if y'all stop doing the work, the needle does not move. So I thank you for doing the work. I thank y'all for showing up and activating and building with me. And I hope I'll come back next time.